And then finally, for our external layers, we're going to write the test and implement the authentication remote data source. Now, what are we going to do for this one? Remember, this is an interface. We're not going to be testing the interface. We're only going to be testing the implementation. You could go ahead and create a different file for this, but I'm just going to put this in here. Usually we put this in the same place as the implementation for the remote data source. So I'm going to copy this over. Auth remote data source implementation. You can type that out in full station, or you can just make it impl extends authentication remote data source. Oh, that's no, it implements because it's an implementation. It will implement implementation authentication. That is a long name. That's too long. I'm sorry, I can't do that. Auth remote data src impl. I'm so sorry. That's too long. I can't follow good coding practices in that case. It's too long. Boom. We make sure that we have asynchronous functions. Always asynchronous functions. Now we have these. We're in our red phase in our test. We haven't written the test yet, but when we write this test, we will be in our red phase because we haven't written any implementations. So now that you've learned how the repository implementation testing works, let's go ahead and learn the structure of a remote data source test. What do we do in a remote data source test? First of all, we check to make sure that it returns the right data when called to the client or to the dependency or whatever, or when called to the server, or when the response code is 200 or the proper response code. So the reason why I'm doing this is because sometimes, for example, for create users, we're going to be doing a post request. If you know anything about HTTP requests, post requests rather return a 201 conventionally, not a 200. So if you're only checking for 200 for your success, then when there's a 201, your app will rather throw an error, even though creating user was successful. So instead of considering only 201, make sure that you know what method you're calling. If it's a post request, check for 200s and 201s. I think delete has a different one as well. I think delete also has 201s inside of it. I'm not too sure. I don't remember. Or 204s. I don't remember. You can check them on Google, but I know that post requests have sometimes 200s and sometimes 201s. Some people make them 200s. I don't know why they do that, but normally it should be 201. No. So let's go ahead and no, I'm still teaching you the structure, so let's not write the test yet. So the second part is, so this is 1. For 2, we check to make sure that it rolls an exception, a custom exception with the right message when status code is the bad one. I guess I could call it a bad one. So look how similar the tests are. So for this one, we write a test to check when the remote source. Let me show you the test rather. We check to make sure that when a remote source is successful, we do this, and when the call to a remote source is unsuccessful, we do the other thing. But then in here, we're rather going to be doing the same thing, but on the upper level. So we're moving one step higher. Instead of checking on the remote source, we're checking on the response code. So the first one was when the call to the remote source is successful, do this or do that. When it's unsuccessful, do this or do that. In this case, for the remote source, when testing the actual remote source, you do this instead. You say when the response code or when the server's response, which is the same thing as the response code, right? Or you can say when the status code rather, when the status code is this, do this or that. And when the status code is that, do this or that. So let's go ahead and write the tests for these. Let's go into our remote data source and create a new .test file. That is a long name. I hope I don't mess it up. Authentication, yes, remote data source. Now, what is our dependency in this case? You can see that in here we've created the implementation. What does this implementation depend on? It will depend in this case on the HTTP library. So in that case, let's go ahead and add HTTP to our Flutter project. I'm going to do this Flutter bulb add HTTP and Flutter bulb get. That should add me the HTTP library